just come back to this diagram and then kind of just added some color to try and add some clarity. Okay. So the blue shows the expectations, right? And then when our expectations are not met by reality, so if aggregate demand shifts by greater than the expected amount, then we've got green. And if aggregate demand shifts by less than the expected amount, then we've got red. That's basically how I have changed that. So there's the end result is that when your expectations match reality, there's no change in output. When your expectations of inflation are less than what we get in reality, then output increases. And when our expectations are greater than what actually happens, then Y decreases. Okay? So, we want to understand the relationship between inflation and unemployment. Our short-run Phillips curve says the following. It shows the relationship between inflation and unemployment holding constant expected inflation rates and the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, so those are the two things that are constant. So if we form an expectation and that expectation is fixed, what is the relationship then between unemployment and expectation? Also assuming that the natural rate of unemployment is fixed. In other words, our full employment level of output is fixed. Okay, natural rate of unemployment is fixed means long run aggregate supply is fixed. That does not shift. It's set at one position. So what do we end up with? What we can end up with is, if this is our long run aggregate supply curve level of employment, in other words, it's the natural unemployment rate. So we're measuring unemployment. Okay? Are you happy that the natural unemployment rate is the same as saying the full employment level of employment? Full employment. Oh, sorry, I was supposed to move that thing over and I didn't. Okay? So you got full employment. So it's the natural rate of unemployment, which is the same as saying long run aggregate supply curve level of output. Okay, long run aggregate supply output level. That's what the natural rate of unemployment means. So if we're at point A, okay, our expectations are fixed, we can end up at a position like point B. Oops. We can end up at a position like point B, and if we look at point B, what do we have? We have a higher rate of inflation, but a lower rate of unemployment. Okay? How do we get this sort of relationship? Well, let's look at our aggregate demand, aggregate supply curves. We can shift aggregate demand so that our level of inflation rises above the expected level of inflation and at the same time produces a higher level of output. You with me? Sorry? Okay. If our expectations of inflation are fixed, okay, so we expect inflation to be this level here, the difference between PE and P0. So we shift our aggregate supply curve to this position. This represents our expectations of aggregate demand. We expect aggregate demand to be there. Okay? If we increase aggregate demand by more than the expectation, by more than the expected increase in aggregate demand, what do we end up with? Higher inflation, but higher output, right? If we have higher output, what is happening to our unemployment? Our unemployment is decreasing, right? So we can end up in a position with higher inflation and lower unemployment if we increase aggregate demand by more than what was expected. Right? Everyone happy with what I've drawn here? Okay? That would be a movement from point A to point B. What about a movement from point A to point C? What does point C have? Well, point C has lower inflation but higher unemployment. How does that happen? Well, what did we see when our expectations, right? When we expected inflation that was greater than what we anticipated, right? If we anticipated inflation of PE, okay, but our aggregate demand shifted by less, what do we end up with? Lower inflation than what we expected, but also lower output. Okay? In other words, when our aggregate demand curve shifts by less than what we anticipated with our aggregate supply shift, we end up at a position to the left of our long-run aggregate supply curve. Okay, so we've got a lower level of output and prices have increased by less than what we expected. Okay? So at point A, we expect some rate of inflation. We actually have that rate of inflation. Therefore, we are at the natural rate of unemployment. If, however, inflation is greater than what we expected, unemployment decreases. If inflation is lower than what we expected, well, unfortunately, we have more unemployment. So the Phillips curve suggests that in the short run, we have this trade-off between unemployment and inflation. In other words, we can move away from our long-run aggregate supply curve. In other words, move away from our full employment level of output. But the only way we can do that is through some effect on inflation that we did not expect. So if inflation increases by less than we expected, we will have more unemployment. If inflation is greater than what we expected, we will have less unemployment. Okay? Yes? That's right. So point C would correspond to a point below full employment. Our output is decreasing. It would suggest, yes, we'd be associated with something like a recession. Right? Because our output is lower than our full employment level. Or it's decreasing. Okay? So if I just drew this point A at the natural rate of unemployment, if I drew a straight line through that point, that would correspond to all the rates. Any point along this line would be a point where our expected inflation is equal to our actual inflation. We will always be at the natural rate of unemployment when our expected inflation equals our actual inflation. Okay? But what's interesting about this long-run relationship, okay, which corresponds to a situation like this, right? What do we see here? It doesn't matter what the price level is, our full employment level is independent of that price level, right? So our long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical. What does that mean? It means that it doesn't matter what the price level is, our full employment level of output remains unchanged. So we can increase aggregate demand, but any increase in aggregate demand that's met by a decrease in aggregate supply leads to an increase in prices but no change in output. Okay? So when our expectations of inflation meet the actual inflation and we're always at the long run level of output, it doesn't matter what the price level is, we're always producing the same level of output. correspondingly, it doesn't matter what the inflation rate is, as long as our expectations equal the reality, we will always be at the natural rate of unemployment. Okay? So what that's saying then is, if we move momentarily, say, to point B or to point C, what happens? Well, let's go back to our ASAD diagram, and let's take, for example, we had let's deal with this one. We had a shift in aggregate demand that was greater than the shift in aggregate supply. So we had prices rising by more than what was anticipated. What does that mean for labor? It means that labor's real wage has decreased. Even though they increased their nominal wages increased by less than the price level increase, which means that their real wages fell. So we've increased employment because real wages have fallen. Once labor realizes that this has happened, or once they are able to adjust their nominal wages to take account of this fall in real wages, which they did not anticipate, what do? They shift their aggregate supply further to the left. If they shift aggregate supply further to the left, what do we end up with? We end up with even higher inflation and back to our initial level of output. If I shift my aggregate supply curve because I increase my nominal wage demands even further, my aggregate supply curve shifts even further to the left, and I end up with higher inflation, even higher inflation, but I end up back at my initial level of output. In other words, if I move temporarily to point B, what do? I increase my wage demands because I now anticipate higher levels of inflation. Okay? How is that represented in my Phillips curve? What happens is my Phillips curve will shift to the right. In other words, at any given inflation rate, I now anticipate higher rates of inflation, and that anticipation of higher rates of inflation shifts me from Y1 back to Y0. In other words, it decreases my unemployment. So as my expectations of inflation increase, it means at any given inflation rate, my unemployment rate will in fact be higher, right? My Phillips curve, short-run Phillips curve, shifts to the right, so that my expectations of inflation match reality once again. Okay? So as soon as I change my expectations about inflation, I shift my aggregate supply curve, the relationship between the actual inflation rate and my level of unemployment changes. So when I change my expectations of inflation, I shift my aggregate supply curve. A shift in the aggregate supply curve is the same as a shift in the short-run Phillips curve. So what we have here, if we look at the short-run Phillips curve relationship, is a relationship between unemployment and inflation rate. Inflation rate we can show mathematically just as P dot. That's just like maths lingo for meaning a change in prices. Okay. So we've got a relationship between unemployment and price level that is negative, and the aggregate supply curve in the short run is a relationship between employment and price level, which is positive. Employment, the inverse of employment is unemployment. When we plot unemployment against price level, the relationship is inverse. When we plot employment against price level, the relationship is positive. The Phillips curve is basically just the inverse of the supply curve, right? The long run aggregate supply curve is vertical. The long run Phillips curve is vertical. The short run aggregate supply curve, as prices go up, employment goes up. As prices go up, employment goes up, which means unemployment goes down. So the relationship is negative, the relationship is positive, but it's basically the same curves that we are plotting. Okay? Cool. So we've got a long run and a short run Phillips curve, and then that's all that we have on the slides here. And then we go to the business cycle. Okay, so any questions about the Phillips curve that I can sort out now? Would you like to do like a worked example? Oh, that one? Yeah. With what? When I decreased what? This one? Yeah. When they moved the curve down. How did the curve move down is what you're asking. Okay, cool. Let's do that as an example. Okay. So let's draw a Phillips curve and an ASAD model. Okay, so we've got price level against output, and then you've got inflation, and I'm just going to use inflation as P dot, and unemployment. Okay, so we've got a long run aggregate supply curve. We've got a long run Phillips curve. We've got a short run aggregate supply curve, and we've got an AD curve. And we've got a short run Phillips curve. Okay, we've got some point of equilibrium, which means that our expectations of inflation match our actual inflation. Okay, we're on our long run aggregate supply curve, we're on the long run Phillips curve. It means that our expectations of inflation match actual inflation. Okay, the question then is the following. What shifts the Phillips curve, or the short run Phillips curve, so the short run Phillips curve to the left? Okay. So that was the question that was asked, and my question to you is basically the same. What I'd like you to do is illustrate, okay, so when the short run Phillips curve shifts to the left, illustrate what we would expect to be the situation in our ASAD model. Okay? So if our Phillips curve has shifted to the left, okay, so we've gone from SRPC0 to SRPC1, what is that telling us? It's telling us that our level of inflation, our expected level of inflation in the long run is lower. Okay? That's what a shift to the left is telling us. Our expected inflation is lower. What would lead to lower expected inflation expectations? Why would we lower our expectations, our inflation expectations? And then, what would that look like in the ASAD model? Before you embark on trying to answer it, let me recap exactly what the alternative was that we discussed. Okay? We said if we were at a point like point B, for example, okay, the way that equilibrium would be restored from a point like point B would be for the Phillips curve to shift to the right. Why does the Phillips curve shift to the right if we're at point B? Well, if we're at point B, what it's telling us is that inflation is higher than our expected inflation rate. If our expected inflation rate was equal to the actual inflation rate, I would be at point A. If I'm at point B, it's telling me that the expected inflation rate, right, which is given by the inflation rate at point A, my expected inflation rate is lower than the actual inflation rate, which is given by point B. So we saw what that would look like in this diagram here. If my expected increase in prices was less than the actual increase in prices, okay, how does the economy adjust? Well, labor then increases its expectations on inflation, right? And that increase in expected inflation does what? it leads to an increase in nominal wage demands, which shifts the aggregate supply curve to the left, and I end up back at my initial level of output, but with higher levels of prices, and with higher, therefore, expected price levels. So higher levels of inflation. So now I'm back at my equilibrium, but with a higher expected inflation rate. Okay? Now what I'm saying is right. If we have a shift in the short run Phillips curve to the left, why is that happening? What would be the case in the aggregate supply curve, in the ASAD model, that would generate something like this, that would shift a short run Phillips curve to the left? Right, well, what we can do is we can start off next week with the answer to this, so you can think about it for a little while, because we've come to the end of the lecture. So the answer to point B lay in this diagram. The answer to point C lies in this diagram. Well, could lie in this diagram, but it lies in a similar kind of situation. Okay?